Okay, I think we are starting now. Very nice to see the turnout for this seminar, because I think we have several reasons for holding this seminar today, obviously. One of the main reasons is that we have a researcher, sort of like a visiting fellow, Kwesi Aning, who is with us for 3 months here in Copenhagen. And he's been here since early March. Will stay until late May, working with us on a big program that we've been working on for the last 5 years in Ghana's role in peacekeeping. He's also one of the big regional experts, one of the big global experts on West Africa from the region, West Africa, specifically Ghana. And we would like everybody to have sort of like the opportunity to hear a lot of what he has to say. But of course, we have a lineup of very interesting speakers apart from Kwesi. We have Nina Villain, who is the research director in Egmont, Brussels. It's a think tank in Brussels. She has been touring the European media, I don't think I'm saying too much when I say that, about the many coups that have been taking place in the region. So I thought it would be very interesting to have Nina here as well, to actually talk about sort of the latest and how these coups are evolving inside the countries of West Africa where they're taking place. And then, of course, we have our main Russia expert at DIS, Flemming Splidspool Hansen, who is really also one of the big capacities on Russia, and what he's actually the only one who is not an Africa expert on the panel, but really a Russia expert, so really looking at West Africa from the perspective of Russia, which I think will also be really interesting. And then we have Naya, who is our migration expert, and has also been doing a lot of field work in Ghana, who will be talking about migration, which is obviously still an ongoing issue in West Africa, on young people, older people who want to leave West Africa for greener pastures, they think, and what that looks like today. So the overall reason then, apart from the amazing panel that I just presented, the overall reasons why we wanted to do this seminar at this time is also because, of course, West Africa has also been sort of like, you know, a little less attention on anything going on south of Europe at the moment because of Ukraine, because of Gaza, Israel. So it means that, you know, the Danish public specifically can't, of course, have attention on more than one conflicts, and now there are two, so it means that we don't really understand, we don't really focus on what goes on outside these two conflicts. But of course, West Africa is not going anywhere. We have a historical link to Africa that is going back hundreds of years, and Africa continues to influence Europe, and Europe continues to influence Africa. So I think that really this is also now an opportunity to just get some of the very latest of what goes on in the region, which is why we have called it West Africa Now seminar. So I would like to, so basically I would say sort of the program, we have 4 presentations of 20 minutes max, then we have a Q&A at the end. And I think, well, so just shortly, Kwesi is going to speak mainly to the political dynamics of the region through the prism of ECOWAS, the regional organization in the region. Nina, as I said, will talk about sort of coups and the implications of coups for the security sectors in the Sahel mainly. Flemming will talk about Russia's role in the region, and I will talk about sort of the migration dynamics of the region. Yeah. So first we have the presentations, then we have questions, and we finish sharp 5 p.m. because it's one of the complaints I get every time that we go over time. So we won't do this today. So please, Kwesi.
Well, Peter, let me thank you very much for the invitation, and let me also thank the speakers and the panelists. So I've titled my paper ECOWAS's Balancing Act Between Democracy, Security, and Disintegration. About 2 months ago, West African and African Union leaders met in Accra and discussed a topic titled Reflections Forum on Unconstitutional Changes of Government. And both ECOWAS and the African Union made a very stark set of statements relating to democracy. According to ECOWAS, The recent coup d'etats in some of our member states are a clear indication that we must renew our social contract, strengthen our democratic institutions, and refocus on delivery-oriented governance. The African Union was not to be left behind. And it says Africa has reached a tipping point. And the Commissioner for Political Affairs, Peace and Security made a plea to the continent, quote, to return to being an axis of progressive democracy, a continuum of peace, stability, and sustainable development by enforcing the continent's zero tolerance to unconstitutional changes of government. My own president, who is a wordsmith, waxes lyrical, had this to say: when the state apparatus is seized to muzzle freedom of expression, citizens begin to feel that democratic processes have taken them hostage, and often they celebrate anything that looks like an end to their present predicament. I ask two questions. Where have these leaders been when things were going wrong? And why are they saying what they are saying now? Is it because they want change, or is it because they are talking about change in a desperate desire to preserve the status quo? So this afternoon, I intend to do two things. One, focus on the state of democracy in West Africa. I will leave the insecurity bit for my colleague Nina. And secondly, talk about ECOWAS's responses to these undemocratic changes. But I'll give you my conclusion. Undemocratic changes have taken place, are taking place, will continue to take place because Abuja is clueless. The quality of leadership coming out of ECOWAS's headquarters or commission is incapable, unwilling to take up the fight to deepen democratic processes. Why do I say so? Just about 10 days ago, the Togolese elections have been postponed. The president has changed the constitution, and ECOWAS has not spoken. Because of these weaknesses by ECOWAS, we are seeing a sub-region that is shaken by unprecedented violence, resulting in 6 coups d'etats and 4 failed coups d'etats. Until 2020, there was an almost triumphalist march towards deepening democratic norms, especially after Yahya Jammeh of Gambia had been thrown away in 2016 or 2017. But Togo and Gambia are very interesting because between 2014 and 2015, West African civil societies had struggled to change, first, the treaty establishing ECOWAS, but also, secondly, ensuring that unconstitutional changes, both by the military and by the civilian presidents, who actually are very adept at changing constitutions to suit them or manipulating it to suit them, should be a thing of the past. 2 countries resisted this change, Togo and the Gambia. Between 2015 and 2020, there wasn't a single undemocratic change of power in West Africa, showing a unique period of stability. Since then, however, the democratic projects have faced challenges, contributing in no small part to the resurgence in coups. I argue that the coups are going to continue, and they will continue, precisely because the constitutional democratic experiments are narrow, elitist, exclusionary practices of democratic politics that results consistently in demands for change that are getting violent by the day. The end result is a sub-region with a huge growth in demography, but not capable of responding or unwilling to respond to the needs of its populace. So what are the trends as we see now? 2024 particularly is going to be a difficult year for the continent. For the first time in its post-colonial history, almost 18 countries are going for elections. So we have had a stunning victory in Senegal. Faye has won against all the odds. Faye has won, but he's in a difficult place, between a rock and a hard place. Because President Sall has demonstrated that any stubborn person can change the constitution and get away with it. Faye has won, but the expectations from the youth are massive. And his ability to deliver on the public goods that are expected by the population is that his partners begin to have a conversation with him. Of course, we know there are a couple of his old partners who would rather see that there is a coup and then a much more amendable regime is put in power. Ghana heads into a very difficult election in December 2024. An incumbent president who cannot stand, represented by his vice president, driven a buoyant economy into the doldrums, and an old president who was kicked out because of incompetence and supposed corruption are the contestants in December. So Ghanaians basically don't have any choice. I mean, between a government that has destroyed the economy and one who didn't fare too well 8 years ago. In Mali, political parties have requested for a timetable for the elections. The junta's response has been very clear that it has suspended all political party activities until further notice. As I said earlier on, Togo's elections have been rescheduled until April 29th after delaying the ballot over a highly contested constitutional reform. The Eyadema family has ruled Togo for almost about 65 years. The president has just decided that, look, the president should not be elected by popular vote. That is the parliament that should elect the president, knowing very well that his party is going to sweep the parliamentary elections. This is a recipe for problems. But once more, the sub-regional organization, ECOWAS, that determines and defines the normative frameworks under which democratic practices and elections must be held, has kept quiet. But during the questions and answers, I will provide some more details. Of course, Faye has won his stunning victory. Guinea-Bissau, 4 coups d'etats, more than a dozen attempts. The president has deferred the elections twice, including the one that ought to have been held in December 23, alleging that there's a coup d'etat. In Burkina Faso, scheduled elections intended to restore a democratic civilian government in July 2024 have been deemed, quote, not a priority and indefinitely postponed. So we have fairly positive stories like the one in Senegal. In Liberia, George Weah, the superstar footballer, lost, and he very politely and like a gentleman handed over power and, has moved on. But this year, as I've said earlier, is going to be very difficult. As a non-entrepreneur, ECOWAS that ought to provide the guidelines shared by all member states is failing to do so. The end result is that coup d'etats are beginning to challenge both the political order and the democratic processes and the voluntary principles inherent in ECOWAS's supplementary protocol. These incidences then raise a fundamental question. What will ECOWAS's democracy project be if its own member states refuse to accede to the norms that they have voluntarily signed on to. And I think this is a question that we would need to continue to talk about. The ECOWAS challenge relating to democracy is also closely related to the insecurity I think that Nina will be talking about. Because every single coup d'etat has related that coup to two things, to corruption and to insecurity. But in all the successful coup d'etat states, insecurity has gotten considerably worse, democracy has been undermined, and corruption has become a fulcrum around which the government revolves. ECOWAS, distinguished ladies and gentlemen, I would argue, is at a very dangerous crossroads. Dangerous crossroads because, as Nina might possibly tell you, the three Sahelian states that have left account for more than 54% of ECOWAS's territory, but they only make up 7% of the GDP and have a population of 16%. Nevertheless, I would argue that if ECOWAS is incapable of renegotiating and getting these three countries back, it will undermine and threaten the ECOWAS democracy project. ECOWAS will also cease to exist as we know it. It will then become an economic community of West African coastal states. We only have about 10 months to prevent this from happening. What are the specific options and interventions that ECOWAS is making? The coup d'etats across the sub-region questions the effectiveness, credibility, and levels of bindingness of 50 years of supposed integration, relating to the extent to which ECOWAS can elicit compliance from its member states with the instruments I argue that they have voluntarily signed on to. What ECOWAS is telling us is that they are using backdoor channels to negotiate with the three countries to come back. My question is, what does ECOWAS have to put on the table to encourage them to come back? And I'll answer myself. ECOWAS has nothing of interest for anybody to want to come back. I think today I have left my passport in my office. Probably the only thing we have that is of use is that we can travel to each other's country for 90 days without a visa. But it's the same as coming here for 90 days with a visa. So ECOWAS is in trouble. ECOWAS is facing two major challenges. One about upholding its own principles, but being pragmatic and open about the challenges that it faces. So the argument that I want to conclude with, that for a regional economic community in West Africa to succeed, whether it remains as ECOWAS or it becomes an ECOWAS, it must be central to the needs of the people to whom it seeks to serve. As at now, ECOWAS's operational utility is mainly for those who work in its organizations, with the exception of having a passport that allows us to travel around. Secondly, that its democracy regime must change. And for the democracy regime to change, this must be done not only by examining institutional change or the external factors in isolation, but rather in context as to how they react. And based on my experiences, I make these arguments clearly, that how ECOWAS can contribute to improving an ECOWAS, that is if the three countries leave, or if they manage to bring them back, is that first, ECOWAS needs to change the character and the frame of its own rules. For rules that are not implementable or will be implemented then those rules must be changed. 2, that ECOWAS needs to develop a set of incremental responses that are binding in their application. Number 3, there should be specific rules and provisions by which the treaty is looked at and the treaties are revised. So the effectiveness of ECOWAS, please tell me when it's 2 minutes. 4 minutes, okay, thank you. So the effectiveness of anything that happens from now, whether ECOWAS or ECOWAS, hinges on a combination of how its institutional attributes and the mechanisms both motivates and punishes those who act in ways that encourage disobedience. The current state of democratic backsliding in ECOWAS shows that more than 30% of its member states don't accede to the rules. And this calls for a strategic and critical reflection by member states, but certainly also of the citizens, on the nature of regional collaboration and integration. The unending cycles of coup d'etats and insecurity and institutional weaknesses, both at national and regional levels, manifest ECOWAS's inability, first, to enforce its own rules, secondly, the undue interference of external forces. And here I don't need to mention any country's name, but if you push me enough during the question time, I'll be very happy to. Third, ECOWAS itself and its heads of states particularly must understand and respond to the wishes and complaints of its community citizens. As my president said, people don't support coup d'etat. They just want change. We have an ECOWAS court of justice, but I, as an individual, cannot bring a case before the court. It has to pass through my government. So for a political rabble-rouser like myself, I can basically not get the Ghanaian government to support my case. So we need to bring citizenship back. And finally, I think ECOWAS must, as a supranational institution, must have the strength to moderate the excesses of elected governments in the sub-region. We have La Côte d'Ivoire, we have Togo, we have Benin, we have Burkina Faso, we have Mali, we have Guinea. The crossroads that ECOWAS has reached means that it's walking a tightrope, and we can flip anyway. But we cannot have an ECOWAS that disintegrates. That would mean, as Peter correctly said, that a couple of millions of people will cross the Sahara Desert and in desperation would want to come up here. Crossing the Sahara is not that difficult, as probably Nina will tell us. No. The networks are there, the pathways are there, and the smugglers will make considerably more profit. ECOWAS must survive and must deliver on its public goods. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Kwesi. Really brilliant overview of the region. We will now have a little bit more narrow overview, because there have been a lot of coups in Sahel in the region. So there will still be a regional focus from our next speaker, Nina Villain. We just need to open her PowerPoint presentation.
So I felt that Kwesi gave a lot of stuff that I need to follow up on, but unfortunately I'm not going to be able to do that.
In the Q&A.
In the Q&A, maybe. No, that's not mine. this one. And then that one works, I think. Yes, so as Peter said, I've been speaking a lot about coups for the past 9 months or so. So I thought I should speak a little bit more about what happens after the coups. And the argument that I'm presenting today is from a policy brief that I published about 2 weeks ago, and it's called Procurement by Proxies: How Sahelian juntas acquire equipment from ousted security partners. And basically, the main argument of this paper is exactly that. It's trying to show how the juntas in Niger and Mali have ousted Western and multilateral security partners, asking them to leave without delay to be able to get their hands on equipment, ammunition, weapons, infrastructure, military bases, and so on. So that's the main argument. And I'm going to... No, it goes further. So I'm going to divide the presentation into 3 parts. First, I'm just going to give you a very brief outline of the coup context in which this procurement, as I call it, very kindly, because of course it's not procurement as it usually is, but a type of acquisition, a type of theft, if you want to. And then I'm going to go into more detail in 2 case studies: MINUSMA, the UN mission that has been deployed to Mali for a decade, and also to UCAP Sahel Niger, the EU CSDP operation that has been deployed to Niger for a bit more than a decade, and both of which have been ousted recently. And then in the final part, I'm going to put this into a context, in a global security context, and try to figure out a little bit more how this impacts on the global power competition, where Russia, US, the EU, and China are part of currently. So to start, to give you an overview, you already heard Kwesi talking about the different coups. What we've seen is 9 successful coups, 16 coup attempts, depending on how you count, since 2020. So it's not only a reversal of the trend that we saw before of fewer but more effective coups, but we've also seen more coups and more effective coups. So we have approximately more than 65% success rates for coup plotters, which means, of course, that there is, and I agree with Kwesi, we're going to see more coups, because the more successful the coup plotters are, the more they're going to give incentives to others. Out of these coups, 6 have taken place in the Sahel region. We have 2 states which are exemplifying the new phenomena of a coup within a coup. So in Mali, there were 2 coups without return to constitutional rules in August 2020 and in May 2021. So 9 months in between the coups, but still no return to civilian power. In Burkina Faso, the same thing happened in 2022. A first coup in January and a second coup at the end of September. And then, of course, we have an constitutional coup in Chad in 2021, and last summer we had a coup in Niger in July. So this is the context, right? So we have a very fertile ground for new coup plotters, and as we've seen, there have been other coup attempts since then. We also have, as Kwesi was talking about, a very ineffective response by ECOWAS, but also by international partners who are torn in this current global power context between norms and security interests. And I'll come back to that in a little bit. I think I'll also mention just here that what has happened after these coups is that the 3 states, and now I'm talking about Mali, Burkina Faso, and Niger, they have decided to shift security partners. So they have ousted their former main security partner, France, and replaced them with Russia. In Mali, that replacement took 9 months after the second coup. In Burkina Faso, it took approximately 4 months, and in Niger, it took less than 10 days. So we can see that there is a pattern whereby they're learning from each other and trying to emulate what happened in the others. And I'm coming back to Russia and the last part in the conclusion, but this is also important to say. So this is taking place in a global power competition, what I'm going to speak about next. So MINUSMA is the UN mission that has been deployed to Mali for the last decade, between 2013 and 2023. It's a mission that has been considered difficult for many reasons. One is that it has one of the highest peacekeeping casualties of any modern UN peacekeeping mission. So it has been deployed to a very hostile security environment. It's also been debated because it has a robust mandate. So it's been able to go and be more proactive on the field. And it's also been debated because it's been signifying the European or symbolizing the European return to peacekeeping, because there were at some point 26 different European troop contributors, albeit some of them very small troop contributors. But mostly during the past 2 years, it's been controversial because it's been bending to the rules of the Malian authorities. And the Malian authorities, since the second coup in May 2021, has really made it quite difficult for MINUSMA to carry out its mandate. One example is that they imposed a no-fly zone for UN aircrafts for more than 50% of the territory. Coincidentally, that happened at the same time as Wagner troops were deployed to Mali. After that, they imposed demands for flights between 48 and 72 hours notice before they were allowed to fly. Often more than half of the requests that the UN then had to send in to the authorities were left unanswered or were negative answered. So they couldn't actually fly drones or have supervision and reconnaissance flight, which of course also means increased risks for the peacekeepers. Other incidents include that there were they blocked rotation of peacekeepers. They also restricted access to UN peacekeepers to sites of massacres. The most prominent example of that is the Mora massacre, which took place in March in 2022, where FAMA, Malian Armed Forces, troops together with Wagner troops massacred over 500 people in a village during more than 2 days. And for a very long time, UN experts were not allowed to get access to actually examine what had happened because the Malian authorities blocked that access. So when the UN finally got access to that, they wrote a report explaining what had happened, and they waited a whole year to publish that report. So the report was published in May 2023, so last year. And that provoked a lot of anger at Malian authorities because the UN established that Malian armed forces were taking part of these massacres. And only a month later, the Malian junta decided to oust the UN mission, asking the UN mission to leave without delay. So that's an unprecedented incident in UN peacekeeping history, because the Malian junta is, of course, not the de jure, not the legal government, but it is the de facto government of the country. And the UN Security Council was then in a problematic situation where they either had to create a precedent whereby they allow an illegal government, a junta, to decide when a UN peacekeeping mission has to leave, or they will stay against the will of the Malian authorities, who are de facto in control, and also risk the lives of the peacekeepers. So in the end, they settled for withdrawing without delay. A logistical nightmare ensued. They had to close 9 bases, and you can see the map here, and withdraw 13,000 troops within 6 months. So you don't have to be a military logistician to understand that that's quite a difficult feat, and especially as this took place in a very hostile environment, because as soon as MINUSMA left the bases in the north of the country, fighting started again between the Tuareg separatist movements, which had signed a peace agreement with the Malian authorities. And MINUSMA had to withdraw in a climate of very high insecurity. And if that was not enough, the Malian junta decided to make it even more difficult. So they put in flight restrictions. So the UN were not allowed to take flights out of the zones. And they also blocked convoys for over 2 months, meaning that there were 200 convoys that couldn't take out equipment and material from the different bases. They also forced 800 peacekeepers to they also forced 800 peacekeepers to travel more than more than 350, more than 3,500 kilometers, unarmored, without having water and rations, and in a very hostile territory, which meant that they got hit by, or they hit more than 6 IEDs, so mines during that. 37 uniformed personnel were injured. And perhaps what's the most ironic about this was that, of course, as MINUSMA left the bases in contested territory, the northern territories where the separatist movements have been based or are based, the Malian authorities now called the UN traitors because they left too fast. Even though they wanted them to leave without delay, they called them traitors because they did not want to risk that the Tuareg rebels took over the bases. So this is the context. And what happened is that MINUSMA, because it was forced to leave so quickly, had to give, hand over, sell, actually they were not allowed to sell, infrastructure and bases very quickly, and take decisions over whether it was the protection of the personnel or the equipment that was the most important. And luckily they took the decision that it was going to be the personnel that was the most important. So, of course, I don't have all the figures because this is still a liquidation process ongoing at the moment. But so far, from the information that I've got, is that there were destroyed material in 2 of the bases in the north of the country, in the Kidal region, for over $80 million. So just 2 camps out of the 9. That is sensitive equipment, so weapons, ammunition, any type of lethal equipment. And we can say that, okay, well, that's just equipment that the UN can't use for another peacekeeping operation, so too bad. Well, actually, it's not, because this is equipment that belongs to the troop contributing countries. So the UN need to reimburse these troop contributing countries with the $80 million. So it's not just a loss of material, it's also a loss of the UN's budget. And on top of that, and of course, again, I don't have all the information, so I think we can say that these are clearly an understatement. There is also more than 100 containers of DDR, so disarmament, demobilization, reintegration material that have been left behind, containers of this that have been left behind. But of course, these are just crumbs, right? There is also airfields, infrastructure, the bases themselves have been left, and we already know that there have been fighting going on also with Wagner troops moving in to some of these places. So this is one example of how a Malian junta decided to oust a security partner without delay, resulting in the problematic situation for MINUSMA. So moving over to the neighboring state, Niger, UCAP Sahel Niger is a civilian CSTP operation that has been deployed there for the last 10 years, trying to improve the capacities of the local security forces, domestic security forces, so the internal security forces, gendarmes and police and so on. Up until December last year, UCAP Sahel continued to function somewhat normally, although all the operational activities were suspended after Niger's coup in the 26th of July. But it was still present in the country, and they were trying to figure out how they were going to go ahead. But there were strong internal divisions within EU member states. And at that point, after the EU, after Nigerian junta decided to abrogate a law that was hindering migrants from going through Niger up to the EU, a law that the EU had been very supportive of because of trying to, and I'm sure that my colleague is going to speak a little bit more about this. This became a big blowback for the EU because, of course, without that law, migration towards the north is easier, and we can see the smuggling and the trafficking restarting after this law was abrogated. And shortly thereafter, Nigerian junta decided that they were also going to suspend all collaboration with UCAP Sahel, as well as the new EU military mission that was deployed to Niger in April the same year. So December 2023, they asked UCAP to leave. Some negotiations continued between UCAP and the junta, but they didn't really materialize in anything else than that, okay, we're going to have a new withdrawal plan. Again, they asked them to leave without delay. And again, the Nigerian junta decided that they were going to make life extra difficult for the UCAP staff that were left. So 2 incidents in particular. One was when they expelled 15 returning UCAP Sahel members when they were coming back into the country after they had rotated out. They were told to leave because they were considered as I'm not sure if they used the word spies, but they were considered as military, or the UCAP Sahel staff say they were not. In any case, they were not allowed to enter the country again. And just 2 days later, the head of the mission was not allowed to even get out of the plane. There was no clear explanation for why this happened, but she had to leave with the same plane she came with and leave the country. And then 2 weeks later, she had to get a laissez-passer pass from the Ministry of Interior to get back into the country. So you can see that there has been, in French we call it mauvaise foi, I think you can say bad faith in English, from both the junta in Mali but also in Niger. And this resulted in, let's say, unannounced searches. So people from the UCAP staff headquarters were called in for a meeting with the Ministry of Interior on the 19th of February for a long meeting that lasted for more than 3 hours. And when they came back to the headquarters, they realized that there was an unannounced search that had been going on for approximately the same time as they were in a meeting. And during that search, they had seized ammunition, weapons, drones, body armor, all the type of equipment that was in the headquarters. And after this, new searches followed where they seized equipment from the UCAP. And they're still in the process of negotiating for the last equipment to be leaving Niger or being sold in Niger. So all of this, and on perhaps one more thing before I conclude. Just less than a month later, after this incident where they seized the UCAP's equipment and ammunition, the Niger junta decided to oust the U.S. Security partners. And the U.S., as some of you might know, they built one of the biggest drone bases in the region in Agadez, the north of Niger, just a few years ago, where they have been flying reconnaissance missions and drone bases, for the fight against jihadis. So the question now is, of course, what's going to happen to this drone base? It's a $200 million drone base. It costs about $30 million per year to entertain, and the U.S. normally had an accord to keep it going for as long as they wanted to. So that's still up for debate, but of course that's a drone base that will now belong completely to Niger. So all of this is taking place, as I said in the beginning, in a very fraught global competition of power. And as I also said in the beginning, we've seen a shift in security partners towards Russia. So Mali had Wagner troops arriving already in September, October 2021. The number is now up to 2,000. They have been involved in several massacres against civilian populations, but they have also helped the Malian army to take back Kidal, a symbolic town in the north of Mali. In Burkina Faso, the new junta leader, Captain Traoré, has called Putin his strategic ally and has now, since February this year, has also taken up Wagner troops. Now they're called Africa Corps, very closely tied to the Russian intelligence services. And just last week, it was also official that Africa Corps troops arrived in Niger. So we see a complete shift between the French security partnership towards the Russian one. And interestingly, in Niger, Italy and Germany have voiced that they would like to reinforce security collaboration with the Nigerian junta after the US was ousted. So questions remain. What is going to happen to Italy and Germany? How are they going to coexist with the Africa Corps in Niger? And what's going to happen to the equipment? So I'll finish with that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Nina. Really, really, really fascinating sort of to get an insight into the afterlife of these missions, which I think is sort of, just a really, really interesting presentation. We're swiftly moving on to the next very interesting presentation by my dear colleague, Naya, who will speak about the migration dynamics of the region.
Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be here. Now to something different, but relatedly, I'm not going to talk about coups d'etats, but about migration. And I put on this beginning slide of the KLM air land minibus as a kind of framing for talking about West African migration. Because what does it mean to be taking the KLM air land minibus rather than the KLM airline? What I will do is to talk about 3 points about West African migration on the kind of overall level. So the first one is that West African migration primarily and really like the biggest bulk of West African migration is intra-regional. It's not towards Europe, and I give you a bunch of quick facts on that. Then I'll talk about mobile livelihoods and migration as an imagined pathway to a better life, and finally about some structural inequalities that inform this. So West African migration at a glance. To start with stating that West Africa is a very mobile region, the most mobile region in Africa. High on the top charts of mobile regions in the world. It's an ingrained part of life and has a long history. And as Peter said in the beginning, there are century-long relationships between Denmark, Europe, and West Africa. And I have to say, as a kind of just mention it, that includes the transatlantic slave trade, that includes Denmark and other European countries, and after that colonizations that also for large parts have established some of the migratory dynamics that we still see today. And that still have importance across West Africa in terms of empires and how the map looks today. So some facts within the region, as I said, it's estimated there's about 7.6 international West African migrants in 2020. I should also just say that numbers are really unreliable. So if numbers don't add up, or if you think I've seen something else, yeah, that's how it is. There are no accurate numbers here. It's estimated that 80 to 90% of these international migrants live within the region, mainly within the neighbouring country or within the big economies, Côte d'Ivoire and Nigeria. And there's also a lot of routine border crossings, simply trade across the border between Ghana and Togo, etc., etc. Fishermen crossing borders as they go fishing, etc. Currently, or last year, there were more than 5 million people of concern to the UNHCR in the region, in the Sahel especially, and that means people who are in some kind of need of protection, internally displaced people, refugees, etc. And this follows conflicts and coups d'etats, instability, etc. that we just heard about. If we look at extra-regional migration, so still within Africa, it's also a tendency to that migration goes to the big economic hub. So Libya has been, was especially before 2011, a huge migration hub for migrants all over the world, including West African migrants. And with the fall of Gaddafi, about 200,000 West African migrants or more were evacuated or fled Libya, including 20,000 to Ghana, and that has also had destabilization effects across West Africa. And there are still quite some migrants in Libya and some migrants also from other places in Africa, and some recent survey estimated that it was, if I can, about 250,000 West African migrants in Libya last year. If we look outside Africa, the main attention, public attention, political attention is to Africans who cross the Sahara and the Mediterranean. But by and large, most African migrants in outside Africa have legal status. There's a lot of skilled migration, doctors, nurses, engineers, what have you. So when discussing that, a key discussion is also the good old brain drain versus brain gain discussion. Some of you may have heard that there was a big council of nurses taking place a few weeks ago, and one of the discussions there was that there's a lot of emphasis, there's a lot of recruitment going on from various countries of nurses all over the world, including in Africa, and the whole discussions whether that's a good idea, if there's some kind of compensation paid to countries that lose qualified personnel. In terms of unauthorized journeys, what we can see there on the broader picture is that a surge in arrivals on the Canary Islands, whereas the Mediterranean routes are going down. And last year that was about a bit more than 40,000 registered arrivals on the Canary Islands. So that's also what we see here. Another important point on this, like go through of this PowerPoint, then it will be more depth, is that stranded migrants and deportations, both from North Africa but also from Europe, also shapes West African migration, because one of the implications of restrictive mobility regimes is that people get stuck, that they cannot go forward, they maybe not be able to go backward because of conflict, because of lack of resources, etc. So they end in camps or living under squalid conditions, and also like large-scale deportations from Algeria, for instance, to often no-man's lands. Final point is climate change. Very often, if we stay in like alarmist scenarios, there's talk about climate refugees, and millions of Africans and other people from the global south will come towards Western countries. What we know from research now is this is not happening. Most climate change migration take place short distance or to urban centers or in the neighboring regions. Of course, if big parts of Africa or other places in the world become uninhabitable, this may change, but it's not what's happening now. This was the quick go through just to show you a couple of maps. They are old maps, so they are not totally updated. Often when we look at maps on West African migration, we see these maps of like yellow arrows turning north. That's actually quite inaccurate, given the big importance of interregional migration. So if you look at this map on intra-African migration over there, you will see all these like circular arrows or going all different kinds of directions. So that's a much more accurate image of the overall routes, though of course it's also an older map, so I miss arrows towards Libya, from Algeria, etc. But that is because these routes also change in this very volatile region. But we can also see that some of these routes are actually old caravan routes. So they're both like very established patterns, and there are newer ones. Then the second point that I wanted to talk about is migration as a mobile livelihood. And a well-established livelihood strategy in West Africa. So that means that it's a normal practice in many, many places. It's not an exception. It's not something that just happened because of this and that. That can be, of course, if there are catastrophes, but by and large, it's very well established across the region that people migrate for their livelihood. So this can be seasonal migration in relation to farm work. It can be trade, cross-border trade or further afield, for short or long labor migration, for marriage, for religion, etc., for all different kinds of reasons. It's also a trend that both men and women migrate. It's often described as feminization of migration, but in fact it's about 50-50 in most countries. It's slightly more men, but not a lot, and in some countries slightly more women. And also children migrate, young people migrate. And as I said, this can be for all kinds of different reasons. That said, it's important that migration across this like huge region is not the same. Even in a place like Ghana, there are differences in terms of who move and how it is perceived at the community and societal level. So broadly speaking, often like planned migration for education or for work can be seen as positive across the board, as encouraged by authorities also, whereas high-risk migration across the Mediterranean and across Sahara will cause a lot of concern from many quarters in terms of politicians, NGOs, middle-class people, and from parents whose whose offspring engage in this kind of migration, but also as a horizon of what is possible for some young people. There's also often quite a lot of concern about women's migration, especially young women's. Are they going to be promiscuous? What happens to them? So there are all these kind of different perceptions of moral concern and what will happen. Is it good and bad that we will know from many other aspects. The dynamics of migration often revolve around affinities, so kinship, affinities, hometown, and other kind of connectivities that do that people can more or less rely on finding somebody somewhere. So a young person can go from a village to a bigger, say Accra in Ghana, and if there's somebody there, it's quite likely that they will support them. Obviously not granted, but these kind of hospitality practices that you look after each other, that you help out, is very established. That also mean that reciprocity, intergenerational, often like paying back and care responsibilities is also an important dynamic, that a lot of migration takes place to take care of one's family, either one's nuclear family, but could also be a distant uncle, your grandmother, your cousin, etc. And these care responsibilities very often are the same or have kind of similar dynamics in countries and without countries. So I met a Ghanaian professor in Ghana a few years ago who took care of 16 relatives in his hometown. But that said, so the better employment you have, and also the farther away in a country where you are seen as having the opportunity to have gainful employment, usually the higher expectations. Often migration, especially low-wage labor migration, is stepwise. It's not like taking a plane. It's not the KLM airline to Amsterdam or whatever, but it's more like improvised along the way, also in these situations of volatility. And Kwesi mentioned, and Nina also, this Saharan migration, high risk, where people will go some of the way, stepwise, maybe to now again Niger or other places, go from there, meet people, travel in big pickup trucks towards the coast, for instance, if they are going further afield. That also means that the idea of like mafia like networks of human smugglers within the West African region is not very pronounced from what I know of, but that it's much more locally organized, self-organized, or with the help of so-called connection men. And I also know from my own research that there are a lot of multiple migration or migration projects, meaning that people might go for some years, say to Libya, or what do I know, to Senegal or whatever, come back again, migrate again, then they might be deported, then they might travel again. So a lot of these remigrations, which also has the implication that the idea of deportation, for instance, stops migration, doesn't work that way in many cases. And then I state that migration constitute an imagined pathway to a better life. I already mentioned the role of care responsibilities from one's own and extended family. And by implication, migration is also seen as a source of social hope, both for the migrant, him or herself, and for the family or collectively. And very often it's seen as a kind of a way to establish a better future for oneself and one's family some years ahead, and then return back home in many cases. So again, that also has the implication that the idea that migrants come here to work and stay is rarely the case. It happens, of course, but it's very often not the main thing. Another implication is also that when migration projects don't work out because changing circumstances, because of deportation, or whatever it could be, it can be very much related to stigmatization to come back home empty-handed, and maybe also to come back home to debt. And again, that has the implication of remigrations in many cases. But migration is not only about intentions or about culture, and here we are back to the KLM air land again, and the question about structural inequalities. It's also very much embedded in governance frameworks, of course, and global and local inequalities, as well as deep-seated sociocultural and socioeconomic patterns. So we already heard a lot about ECOWAS. And as Kwesi mentioned, one of the things about ECOWAS is the free mobility or visa-free travel within 90 days, and the protocol of free mobility, which dates back to 1979, so quite longer than the European Schengen, as a kind of by intention as an integrated space. And of course, we've heard that this may not be as integrated as was intended, and there are also a lot of hindrances in terms of actually realizing this. But it still means that until quite recently, an ECOWAS citizen could travel all the way up to the borders of Libya and Algeria visa-free. It also has the implication that the idea of European countries looking at potential European-bound migrants already when they set off is actually quite problematic, because people have the right to travel. And there's also the big and very growing tendency of increased national, regional, and extra-regional and of continental regulation of migration. How many minutes? 1, 2. Okay, 1, 2. That is becoming more and more restrictive in terms of externalization and militarization of borders. And that gives rise to what I've termed a mobility paradox, zooming out, which is that on the one hand, in the world today, and certainly in West Africa, we have increasing circulation of images of the life of globalization and life elsewhere on the one hand, but on the other hand, access to free and legal mobility is very unequally distributed. So if you're a West African citizen, you may very likely not have access to free and legal mobility. So you have the idea, you can look at it, but you can't have it. And with these words, I'll say thank you.
Yes, I really appreciate my brilliant colleagues from outside the organization, but certainly also the one from inside, as Naya is. And now there's another quite brilliant colleague, if I may say so, who is going to present on something that relates specifically, especially to what Nina and Kwesi were talking about, sort of in and out, about Russia's role in West Africa. And as we know already, it's growing. So please, Flemming, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you for this, and thank you also, of course, to Peter for inviting me to this panel. As he already said, I'm not really an Africa expert, so I'm trying to give you a different perspective, which relates to the role of Russia. And a couple of my colleagues have already discussed parts of this, so I'll try to to present Russian interests in West Africa and in Africa in general, and say a few words perhaps about what we should expect for the future. And the future, of course, is characterized by great uncertainty, not least because of Russia's war in Ukraine, which obviously affects Russia's ability to achieve the effects that it's looking for elsewhere. I'll be quite general in what I say. I was invited by another colleague a few years ago to say something about Russia in the Sahel. And as I said at the time, I don't really see a particular Russia policy when it comes to Sahel. And I don't see a particular Russia policy when it comes to West Africa. And often when you follow the literature, when you see the debate in Russia, it's not that granular. It's much more overall. So I'll present some of this and discuss what Russia is looking to achieve and how it may attempt to do so. We'll start here. This is January. The Prime Minister of Niger is in Moscow discussing possible cooperation. And then we woke up on Friday last week to the news that Russian troops had now arrived. So Russian troops had arrived in Niger, partly, I'm sure, as a consequence of this agreement and the discussions that were held. Russian media reported that Russian troops had arrived in Niger to help combat terrorism, to train local troops, to give guidance to local troops in various ways so that they can combat local terrorists. And when you read this from a Russian perspective and you read the way that they usually describe these things, it can mean anything. I'll just remind you that Alexei Navalny, now dead, former head of leader of Russian opposition, was also termed a terrorist by the Russian authorities. So when they use this in the way that they describe their activities, it gives you an indication of the broad scope of what they can actually do and the type of cooperation that they're willing to undertake. We need to start here. This is the Russia-Africa Summit held in Sochi in October 2019. It was a great success. The Russians were very happy. They were very happy with the attendance. They were very happy with the agreements that were concluded during the summit. And it came against the background of re-emergence of Africa in general in the Russian public. So you would see, even throughout the 2010s, you would see articles in Russian scholarly journals explaining why Africa was actually important. Why do we need Africa? Why is Africa important to Russia? What can we achieve in Africa? And there was an understanding that Russia had failed in a way to really pay attention to developments in Africa in the 90s and the following decade. But that there were good reason now to return. And we should remember, of course, that the Soviet Union had a very strong presence in Africa. The Soviet Union had very strong ties and close cooperation with a number of African states. It sort of disappeared for various reasons, and then it resurfaced in the 2010s, culminating at first, at least, with this summit meeting in Sochi in 2019. And the Russians were guided by a number of interests. And it's actually quite broad. And the idea is to leave a fingerprint somewhere. The idea is also to generate income. The idea is to achieve something. And I'll just try to be a bit more specific about some of these issues. And I've highlighted just a few. One is weapon supplies. This is from the Russian agency that controls weapons exports, Rasaboronexport, so Russian arms export, and it highlights, it's from their website, and it highlights the different countries that they cooperate with and where they find exports. Russia's been very active on the African continent. It has found a futile market. Russia has, until last year, been the second largest weapons exporter in the world, trailing far behind the US, but still number 2. It has now, in the most recent report by SIPRI, the Stockholm International Research Peace Institute, dropped to number 3. It is losing part of its share of on the international arms trade, including also in Africa. But it has been a very generous supplier of weapons. No strings attached, ready to export whatever is needed within certain limits. Of course, it's usually relatively unsophisticated equipment, but there is a market, and the Russians realized at a very early stage that this is an area where they could return to Africa and where they could actually both make money but also create cooperation and connections with some of these local states. And here you see the Africa Aerospace and Defense exhibition in South Africa in September 2022. Rosa Export, of course, is present, and they're trying to sell whatever it is that they can, and they have achieved quite a lot with this. Another area that we often overlook is energy in general. It may be fossil fuels, also a big market for the Russians, both to supply but also to help extract, for instance. But an area that we often overlook is nuclear power. So Russia is a large exporter of nuclear power. It exports nuclear power plants even to EU member states. This is something that has developed within the past 20 years. It's particularly, it was led at some point by former Prime Minister Sergei Kiriyenko, who is now in the Russian presidential administration. He traveled around the world selling nuclear facilities. This Russian agency is Rosatom, so Russian Atom, and this is from their website, and they have a designated Africa website where you can see cooperation between Rosatom, the Russian atomic energy authorities, and various African states. So it gives you also an impression of what they are looking to achieve, what they have achieved already, and how they're trying to build some of this. Here you see energy. This is from a report that just came out earlier this year. It's very, very recent, from the European Parliamentary Research Service. And I'll just highlight one thing now. I speak about energy, nuclear energy. The most recent agreement was between Russia and Burkina Faso. About 3 weeks ago, a representative from Burkina Faso came to Moscow, to Rosatom, to sign the agreement, and the Russian authorities will now start developing nuclear facilities, nuclear energy in Burkina Faso. But you will see how spread out it is, and you will see the different types of activities that they have an interest relating both to the supply of expertise, but also to selling energy, selling equipment that can be used, but also helping in the extraction and then making a profit from this. And then, of course, as Nina already discussed, military supply. Really an interesting point. So military supply in different ways. It's mainly tactical. This is from Burkina Faso. It's a statue of Wagner soldiers, Wagner troops. And we focus very much on Wagner, of course, for good reason, because Wagner has been very instrumental in this. There are other groups. Other groups will also emerge, Russian groups, private military companies that will be used. But the Russians realized at an early stage that this was very attractive. This was an arena where they could achieve something with relatively little, but they could achieve great effect. So if we look at some of these instances where Wagner troops have been deployed, relatively small numbers, sometimes numbering just a few tens, sometimes hundreds, maybe a few times a couple of thousands, but generally quite limited. And they offer various services. We usually say that they come with, it's already been documented, a very, very robust strategic culture. When we speak about a robust strategic culture, it's a standard euphemism for saying something is really aggressive. So it's very aggressive, no limits. And they offer various types of services. So they offer services in the physical domain, tactical operations, for instance. It may be bodyguard service, it may be instructors, and they will help in different ways. They will offer services in the cyber domain. This is also something that they do. And then, of course, increasingly, which is really interesting, especially when it relates to something as coup, for instance, services in the cognitive domain. So information operations taking place in the cognitive domain, and the Wagner Group will arrive with a catalog. And then, depending on the political connections, of course, the local authorities may cross out certain parts that they would like to have, say, this is what, tick the different boxes and say, this is what we would like to buy. Or perhaps you can just extend it to us, but they offer this in different ways. And here you see an example, again, from a recent report by the European Parliamentary Research Service that shows the Wagner military presence. It changes quickly, but I assume this is this is still correct because this is very recent, but it changes quickly, and you will see how Russia has been involved. They've deployed troops. You will see up here the red lines will show you how the Minister of Foreign Affairs, Sergei Lavrov, has toured the continent. Ministry of Defense has also toured the continent. And this is something that they can offer, and it's really attractive to the Russians to do so, because it creates these connections and it creates a kind of dependencies on continued Russian support. They've gone even so far. This is an article from a leading Russian newspaper. This is February last year, so February 2023. And they ask whether the Wagner Group will replace the UN in Africa. So the idea is that we can supply you with something else. Now you've had the UN peacekeeping troops. Forget about those. We have a different tactical option for you. We may supply you with Wagner troops. The Wagner troops will take care of you. The Wagner troops will achieve what it is that you're looking to achieve. And so they will deliver the operational effect that the UN peacekeepers, for various reasons, have been unable to do. And so there's a discussion in Russia about this relating to Africa in general, and of course also to West Africa. Now, as I said, Russian troops arrived in Niger on Friday last week, and we will definitely see more, given at least Russian interest, but also we need to see, of course, if they have the capacity to continue to deliver. Now, all of this different interests relating to Africa in general and to West Africa have been in place for a number of years. They were recognized, as I said, throughout the 2010s. It's become more acute now. It has become more acute because of the war in Ukraine. And the war in Ukraine has changed some of these dynamics in the way that Russia now has more need for Africa than it had before. And we see this, for instance, when it comes to voting patterns. This is just one example. You will see different votings in the UN system, of course, and you will see the results from these systems. The Russians are very much concerned about this, and they highlight all of these, the votings, they analyze the votings, they present it in media, and so the Russian public is presented with who's with us and who is against us, and they offer great attention to this. But Russia now is more dependent on Africa. It's dependent for political support. Political support in the UN system. It's dependent for African states also to reach out and to say we support what you do in Ukraine, or at least we abstain, at least we don't condemn what is happening in Ukraine. And here, this is an example, as I said, of just one vote, and you will recognize, of course, that Eritrea on the Far East has been voting together with Russia for on a number of occasions. What does this mean for us? Well, it's very problematic. As I said, the relationship now, Russia has strong interest in Africa. These interests are now even stronger than they were before Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022. The threshold for cooperation has been lowered. The Russians are willing to engage to the extent that they can. They will do so for economic reasons, they will do so for political reasons, they will also do so even if they need to subsidize some of the activities that they do. Let's say weapons supplies or the deployment of Wagner troops, where local authorities will never really have to pay. But it's a way of establishing connections, it's a way of creating dependencies. The Russians have no strings attached, or if they do, we often speak about conditionality policy. So a particular characteristic, of course, of our development policy has been conditionality. So if you want the money, then you need to do certain things. The Russians rarely do this, and if they do, it is what we would call cross-conditionality, meaning that the Russians would ask for the exact opposite of what we ask for. So it's cross-conditionality that makes it really difficult. So if we ask, let's say our foreign minister is traveling to the West, to West Africa, and sets conditions for cooperation, the Russians call local authorities the next day and say, we would like to supply whatever they offered, but don't do what they tell you to do. In fact, you should do the opposite. You don't have to be democratic. You don't have to respect human rights. You don't have to respect all these different things. That makes it very complicated. A good thing for us would be that the Russians are, of course, limited by circumstances. They're limited by the war in Ukraine. They're limited also by what it is that they they can offer at the end. So if we look at to the big players, also when it comes to West Africa, of course, Russia and China, the Chinese are supplying something very different. But what the Chinese can supply is infrastructure. The Russians do not supply infrastructure. They don't have the funding for infrastructure. They don't leave motorways behind or other types of facilities. They can offer what I just described, whereas the Chinese can offer infrastructure. So if we take away something positive, it is the fact that it's difficult for the Russians to challenge us, or rival us when it comes to some of the development programs that we can offer. But then, unfortunately, the Chinese may be behind, and they can sort of rival some of the things that we can do. But it is, of course, a challenge for us. And let me just advertise and then try to sum up a piece that I wrote by invitation of Peter on the Russian approach to peacekeeping, and it should be interesting for everyone. But it is interesting within this context because it points in the direction of what I just said, that Russia will be engaged in Africa. It's part of the debate. They'll be engaged in West Africa. They will be engaged with a lowered threshold for intervention. They'll be ready to submit troops, to deploy troops. They'll be ready to offer financial, political, and other types of support to local authorities, even authorities who have come into place after a coup. They will do so in rivalry with the West. They will often sort of counter the demands or the offers made by us simply to find a way in. And it points in the direction of a more conflictual relationship. So a more conflictual relationship between Russia on the one side and the West on the other side, including when it comes to the countries of West Africa. How do we manage a country that has seen multiple coups, for instance? What are the requirements, the demands that we should set? And the Russians have a very, very different agenda from ours when it comes to this. So with this, I suggest to end, and then join the scene with my colleagues. So thank you.
Thank you for that, Flemming, and thank you also for advertising our special issue coming out in International Affairs with a lot of Africa-focused papers as well. So look out for that in May. Nina is also contributing, so it's going to be incredible. But not talking about that anymore. I would like to invite all of you up to the stage, and we open now the floor to questions. I have a ton of questions and follow-up questions, but I think I won't start. I would like you guys to ask some questions. Don't be shy. Yes? Our friend here maybe first, and then Mike, because I know Mike, so we're being polite to the foreigners.
Hello, my name is Benno. First of all, thank you very much for your presentations. My first question goes to you, Kwesi. So could you maybe elaborate a little bit on the question, what the prospects are for the ECOWAS to get the 3 countries back in, and what the ECOWAS has to offer? The second question goes to you, Nina. So I heard that the head of the EUCAP Niger mission wasn't allowed to leave the country, actually. Do you know what the status is on that? Yeah, that's it.
I think we're going to take a few questions before going to the panel. Mike?
Hello, Mike Spears. Thank you for a really interesting and very clear overview of some of these trends. And concluding with a picture of the Danish foreign minister begs, of course, the question about the new Danish Africa strategy. Do you have any comments or observations on the new strategy? What should Danes be doing in the context that you've just presented in relation to the issues of power struggles and so on? And that brings me to a dimension which I think is a little bit missing from what you've outlined, and that is the economic dynamics in West Africa. Is there growth? Is the region getting poorer? What about inequalities? What what's the economic background for some of the issues that you've mentioned? If you could say a couple of words from your own experience and research, a little bit about the economic context, which of course is quite an important determinant for some of the misery of democratic reversal. And finally, a third question, or a second question. Third question. What about Arlit, the French nuclear power uranium source in northern Niger? What are the French doing with that? Are they going to abandon that? Or are they going to give that to the Russians? I'm curious.
So since that were a lot of questions in two people, I think we're just going to go to the panel for their response, if they have it, if any. Nina, maybe you start, and then we go just the way down.
Yeah. So yes, so I didn't say that, but so the UCAP Sahel head of mission, she was not allowed to enter the country. Then finally she was allowed to enter, but then they decided she was not allowed to leave. So when I say bad faith, it's really bad faith. So it took her 2 weeks to get into the country, and then when she was supposed to leave, they said that she wasn't supposed to leave. And then it took about a week, a little bit more than a week of negotiations, and then all of a sudden she was allowed to leave. So they're now working from Brussels, all of the headquarters staff for UCAP. I can't say anything about Danish Africa strategy. I can say that in Mali, from an external EU perspective, the Danes have been quite proactive to keep relations going after the junta took power. They also have quite strong cooperation projects in comparison to many of the other African EU member states. But the personnel of the embassy has diminished quite radically, and it seems unclear. I know that there has been now, it's a lot of debates going on the EU level about what's going to happen in these coup states, and as we see in Niger, there is a lot of divisions. So you have France, who wants to have nothing to do with any of the Sahel states because they've been thrown out. You have Sweden, who cut all development aid, only having humanitarian aid to Mali, same with France. And then you have, on the other hand, you have Italy and Spain, who are interested in staying there, and Germany, for different reasons, for migration reasons, even though we also know that there is very little migration. And I think I saw statistics, but probably now I can speak about that I had a defense attaché from one of the European countries say about the Sahelian migrants coming to Europe, and he said, yeah, all 3 of them that came to our country last year. To give you an idea of the figures are not as impressive as sometimes stated in the media. So the economic dynamics, okay, well, the coups definitely are not helping. I mean, we're talking about the poorest countries in the world, and with the coups, what happens is usually that you have a 10-year reversal of the economic progression. Especially right now in Mali, the situation is very bad because everything has been put on the security sector. Same goes for Niger, same goes for Burkina. So that means that there is an under development in the socio-economic sector. And so far, there is, I think there is a limit where the population is going to accept that. At the moment, there has been a strong sovereignty narrative pushing forward how we're going to regain parts of the country that are no longer invaded by France and so on. But the security situation is not great either. So the fact that the socioeconomic situation is getting worse by the day is going to have effects for the long term. And then I know I'm speaking a lot. The final point about the Arlit. So I don't think the French are happy to give away that one to the Russians. But I also don't think that they can continue to work in the conditions that there are because they're no longer welcome. Last week or 2 weeks ago, no, more than 2 weeks ago, Iran was there to negotiate to get uranium from Niger. So we have another player coming into the region. And that was also the reason why the U.S. Sent a high-level delegation to Niger in March, trying to push not only for Africa Corps troops not to enter the country, but also for Iran not to get any deals regarding uranium.
Well, thank you very much. I mean, whose perspectives are we looking at? Coups are bad, but our partners have kept very quiet when those who stand up to speak are tortured, their properties seized, the tax authorities used as a conduit for intimidating people. So, as Fleming has said, the failure of our own democratic structures plus the silence of our partners creates opportunities for these coups to take place and for the Russians to come in. I will borrow your cross conditionalities tomorrow when I speak at the new Danish Africa policy to strengthen my point. The US was very disgraceful in its behavior when the coup in Niger took place. The Secretary of State was lying and giving statements that he knew were wrong and making promises to Bazoum that he knew America would not keep. And America stabbed its own partners in the back by attempting to renegotiate with the junta in Niamey. For the Americans, African democracy can be written on the back of a postage stamp, and it's the American interest that determines what happens on the continent. So don't be surprised when fairly decent African democrats are pushed into the arms of Russia and China because of the way that people behave. That's number one. Number two, when the coups took place, both the foreign minister and the defense minister of France spoke to Africans and African leaders as if they were their dogs. And they wouldn't speak to their dogs nor treat them in that way. The shift to Russia particularly, I will blame it squarely on France's behavior and disrespect. On Arlit, $2 for a kilo of uranium, unprocessed uranium. The junta has negotiated $200 per kilo. You know, we need to look at this sometimes also from the self-interest, and I think as Nina said, the sovereignty perspective of these countries and juntas that we are talking about. So, Mike, about the economics. So Nina put all these stuff on the table, on the board. So we have Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, and Guinea. Why is nobody talking about Guinea? Because it's providing the bulk of the world's bauxite and aluminum. Immediately the coup took place, a disgraced French politician, Mr. Sarkozy, with his thing round his ankle, came to Conakry to cut deals for the French companies. The Rusal, Oleg Deripieska's company, big time player, Rio Tinto. The Turks are there, the Indians are there. Guinea and its aluminum plays such a critical role that although Doumbouya is murdering Africans for speaking up for democracy, our partners are quiet. So why are they talking about Mali? Why are they talking about Burkina Faso? Burkina Faso, after almost 50, close to 60 years of independence, made this coup and has made it clear you will not export our gold without establishing a refinery and adding value to the gold. So we may not like dictators, we may not like the military, but they are giving indications of a certain affinity for their own people. And so to understand and to bring change, we need to understand the nature of the narrative that is going on. The economists are not doing well at all, Mike. I am much poorer now in Ghana after almost 45 years of working than the day I started working, because the president and his finance minister have destroyed the country totally. What should the Danes do? Do what you do best. Support the rule of law, human rights, gender equality, health, and insist that when we give you our money, we expect accounting for the money just like you have given it to this or to a Danish company. But more often than not, our partners think, these people are corrupt enough. So if they steal a couple of millions of dollars, but they put up a third-rate hospital, we can still deal with it. Don't deal with it. Recognize the agency that is beginning to bubble up on the continent. There's a re-energization of the continent, and that is why you are seeing demonstrations, clashes, and once more, the stunning and spectacular victory of FAI in Senegal. That is what you should be looking out for. Young people who know IT and all that. As for ECOWAS, it has no prospects for getting these guys back, because the Russians are there. One of the reasons why they left is that when they were in trouble, facing up to terrorists, ECOWAS was more interested in listening to France. They didn't provide any support. They didn't provide political guidance, and basically left them to themselves. My final point, it also depends on the quality of security force assistance. I think Nina and Fleming have told us about those who have been kicked out. Prior to the coup, there were 9 or 10 different states providing capacity building to the Niger armed forces. So what kind of useless intelligence is it that they couldn't read in between the lines that there was going to be a coup d'etat? Because the quality of security force assistance was not for the benefit of the people of Niger. It was looking through the lens, how can we use Niger to prevent the migrants from coming here? How can we use Niger to prevent the terrorists from coming to us? No terrorist is interested in coming from the desert over here. I think there is a universalizing narrative that says the terrorists are coming. And this narrative is because Joseph Borrell, the foreign affairs boss of the EU, keeps on talking about West Africa becoming the center of terrorist violence. That's a bloody lie. It's a bloody lie. Finally, if we take an intersubjective view to it, and we compare the number of dead people through terrorism in West Africa and in the Sahel to the number of people who died through road traffic accidents, if we turn it around to Europe, you wouldn't be focusing on terrorism. You'll be focusing on making the roads more secure for people to drive on, to cycle on, and then to walk.
Thank you.
Thank you, Kwesi. Pay attention to this man.
Yeah.
And now also pay attention to Fleming.
No, because I'll be very brief. I really shouldn't say anything about Denmark's Africa policy, because I don't do much Danish foreign policy, and I don't really do Africa stuff. But I would like just to say a few words, and then luckily my colleague Naja will take over. What we have done and what we're doing is that we are toning down conditionality. So if you look at this new strategy, and if you look at the overall strategy that appeared last year, the foreign and security strategy, you will see that we are becoming more pragmatic. So we're toning down conditionality. We're setting less conditions for cooperation, and that is also because of the war in Ukraine. So we recognize the need for establishing new partnership. It's being said quite openly. So our policy is changing in line with that. That is the overriding interest that we have now, is to mobilize support for the war in Ukraine, for the way that we see the world, and of course for the world order, if we want to raise it to this level, the world order that we want to keep. And let me just say, when Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov tours the African continent, when other Russian representatives tour the African continent, they speak about a post-colonial struggle. So they will turn to these coups, for instance, and they will argue that this is all part of a post-colonial struggle. When international observers, peacekeepers are kicked out, they will say that's also part of a post-colonial struggle. So the Russians will argue, and this is part of the argument that they've been putting together for a number of years, but in particular since their invasion of Ukraine, it is a bit bizarre, but they are actually closely related, these policies. They will say that they now support the post-colonial struggle in the global south in Africa in a different way than they did before. And just to give you one example, when the Russians speak about the war in Ukraine, they often say this has nothing to do with Ukraine. It has to do with world order. And we are fighting now to introduce a more fair, a more open, a more democratic world order, which will also benefit the countries of Africa. So that's part of the argument. Sometimes they speak about Nazis and fascists and genocide and so on. But the world order issue is also very prevalent. And this is what they tour the African continent with, together with weapons and so on. And we need to take that into account. And I think that's part of our new Africa strategy, to take that into account. Say, look, we need to tone down conditionality because these other actors do not set any conditions.
Yeah, so also on the Danish Africa strategy, I would like to shout out for a policy brief that some colleagues and I edited. We asked 5 of our brilliant research partners from the continent what they think should be a part of that. And they had different priorities, so conditionality is problematic, but like the main emphasis across that is like equal, genuine partnership and reflect upon the past. And if it's not genuine, then you can, forget it. So that's really like a main a message from that policy brief. We have also done a range of comments I have written on migration, and 2 points from there is one is the importance of a long-term flexible legal pathways for Africans, and the other is emphasis on recognizing that African politicians are also politicians with constituencies, and there is really a lot of concern and anger and resentment in terms of the way that Africans in relation to migration politics are treated, the indifference of the loss of life on the Mediterranean, how difficult it is to get visas, etc., on deportations that is seen as unfair and embarrassing, etc. So to recognize that migration politics and how it's handled with a big emphasis on deterrence of migration, African migrants as a threat, as terrorists, etc., can have spillover effects on all other policy and political agendas. In terms of the economic context, that's of course very important in relation to migration, because a lot of migration is for livelihoods, for employment, and even when people look for security, they still have to have a livelihood. Right, so there are 2 dimensions that I would like to mention there. One is that for the big and growing young African populations that face unemployment, many of them, migration is often spurred by an assessment that the prospects where they aren't good enough for them to have the kind of life that they would like to, and that life could be to be able to provide for their families. So it's not necessarily, I want a motor, I want a car, etc., but to be able to provide and maybe also have more ambitions. That's one thing, and the other is the importance of remittances. That is very important in many African countries. So migrants within country, from outside countries, sending money to their families back home for food security, for investment in land, for health, education, etc. And in some countries, especially small countries like the Gambia and Cape Verde, it's a huge chunk of GDP. For other countries, it can be less so, but in the West African countries, the biggest bulk of money is into Nigeria, of course, because of the size, but Ghana is also having quite a sizable amount of remittances.
Thank you, Naya. Thank you, everyone. Another round of questions. There was a question down here at the very back.
Oops, I get it here. Okay, thank you. My name is Gert. I'm a PhD student here at DIS, studying exactly this change across West Africa, the new Pan-Africanism or the reoccurrence. And Kwesi, I'm really curious to know, you said that ECOWAS must survive, and we know that President Bassirou Diomaye Faye has said that he wants reforms of ECOWAS, and that is really high on his agenda, especially because, as you say, ECOWAS has absolutely nothing to offer right now, especially with the what is that in the TLICAF, the free trade agreement going into place, and the passport. I mean, it works for the KLM airline, but maybe not for the bus or the car, where you're still allowed to pay. And you know, ECOWAS has this. You said it's a crossroads, but it's almost a dead end, right? With the legitimacy totally being gone, ECOWAS being seen as being an instrument for the French. So how do you see the possibility of ECOWAS surviving and for reforms being made?
Interesting question. There's one more here. Oh, there's one there. Okay, sure. Yours. I saw you.
Thank you so much for your very interesting presentations, offering different perspectives on the West African region. My name is Mary Cruz, and I work at the Danish MFA in the Africa department. My first question would be to you, Kwesi, maybe following a little bit up on the question just raised. On ECOWAS, you had a quite hard assessment of ECOWAS' role and also ECOWAS's response to the coups in the Sahel. I would be interested in hearing what should ECOWAS have done differently right in the aftermath of the coups. For instance, do you think it was right of ECOWAS to impose sanctions on Niger, which is a question that has been debated also widely within the EU? And secondly, my second question is to you, Flemming Splidsbøl, on Russia. Do you see a development in the Russian approach to Africa in recent years, with Russia being more open to offer its assistance cheaper or even for free? At first, when Russia offered assistance to Burkina Faso actually said no because it was too expensive. And now we have seen Russian soldiers, African Corps, Wagner Group entering both Burkina Faso and Niger. So is there development there? Thank you.
We have two more questions. There was one here.
Thank you very much, everybody. I have a very short question for Flemming Splidsbøl. My name is Lisa. I work for the Danish Immigration Service and the University of Copenhagen. And we read in Italian newspapers last year in May that the Italian Minister of Defense claimed that the Wagner Group facilitated the push of migrants across the Mediterranean. Is that in any way plausible? Because I didn't find much else about it. But you must know more.
Of course. One more question here in front, and then we'll give the panel 10 minutes to respond.
Thank you. Two short questions on migration. The first question is, since Russia and Africa are coming closer together, are Russia willing to accept African migrants? And second question is it open for the African population that the governments of Africa do not want to take their illegal immigrants back?
Okay, I think just take it again, Nina.
Okay.
And then we have 10 minutes to respond, so...
2.5 minutes.
Yeah.
Okay, really quickly, I think that there are two contrasting narratives about the coups and how they should be responded to. On the one hand, there are those who promote the pragmatic approach that the US took, that you call disgraceful, Kwesi. Many of the EU member states thought that we should have done it like that, instead of taking a very strong stance, imposing sanctions on Niger, saying that actually this is what the Africans want. Whereas the US was, okay, well, maybe the junta members represent the African population. So I think that there has been two contrasting narratives, both from different African populations and from external actors about who actually represent the will, because we saw that in all three states there were some demonstrations for the juntas when they came to power, but they were also constrained into the population, like to the urban centers, and we don't know of the rest of the countries how popular these juntas are. So I think that it's a bit dangerous to give these juntas more legitimacy than they actually have. We should remember that they took power not by elections, but by contorting the rules. And that's problematic. And it also puts the different actors, external actors, in difficult positions, because the EU has been condemned for taking too hard of an approach, whereas the US has been hailed as taking a pragmatic approach. So that's one point. The second point is that saying that I agree France has a horrible behavior. I have French friends who say we are arrogant by nature. That's in our DNA. And I think that arrogance is particularly visible on the African continent, and which, of course, means that many African leaders turn to other partners. But all of these turns towards Russia have taken place after the coup took place. So it's not the partner that France initially were dealing with, but there are new partners that have turned to another security actor, which is Russia. And then on my third point, 32nd, I think I'm also doing some research on Russia, but I'm not going to take your points, Fleming. But I think that what we've seen is that Russia from the beginning only had ad hoc policy in Africa. They did like stick points operations with very little investment, but with large returns that Fleming was saying, mainly to just disturb Western interests. And as they saw that they worked, they expanded that, especially since 2022, to become more of a coherent strategy to gain more influence on the African continent. And I know that there is a RUSI paper from this year detailing exactly how Russia have described this strategy. One of the main points is to propose regime maintenance packages to these junta to stay in power, which is what many of them want. And those regime maintenance packages are things that Western actors cannot offer. So I think that it went from ad hoc towards a more broader strategy for the continent.
But the regimes that seem to play a particular type of game seem to be also more acceptable, particularly to Western powers. Mr. Ouattara of La Côte d'Ivoire has changed his constitution several times so he can continue becoming Mr. President. And we haven't heard people talk. When Mr. Sall of Senegal wanted to steal the elections, but even more importantly, steal the resources, oil and gas, and give it to his family and friends, the Western nations were quiet. Senegalese people jumped onto the streets and got shot and killed. ECOWAS was also quiet. Let me add to it very quickly. So we need to define the agency and the forces that we want to align ourselves with. That's number one. Number two, for most Africans, we don't like the Wagner Group. But the history of mercenarism on the continent doesn't give any other country the right to start screaming about the Wagner Group. Because other mercenary groups have done even worse things on the continent, backed once more by our friends in Paris. So ECOWAS, Mary, you say I'm a little bit tough. This is actually my more diplomatic side. Because I'll be coming to your ministry very soon, I need to be seen to be a diplomat. But ECOWAS is dead. Long live ECOWAS. How it will live, I don't know, but I'll tell you more when I come to the ministry. Pan-Africanism and FAI. Yes, FAI is saying the right things, but as I said, he's shriveled up hopes, interests, and how he maintains that becomes key to his long-term survivability. I think ECOWAS and the old leaders don't like fire very much. When my president was called during his inauguration to say something to him, you could see he was, fumbling all over the place because his dear old friend, Macky Sall, had been kicked out. So, interesting times ahead, but it can also be very dangerous times ahead.
Thank you. Great questions. I'm afraid I can't really provide in-depth answers on the costs payment for some of these different services. I really don't know, and I haven't seen figures, and I'm not sure if anyone really has the overview. Often it's classified in that neither side has an interest in actually revealing what has happened. When Russia decided to reorientate itself towards Africa, to try to reestablish those relations that had been lost, it also decided to, in a large number of cases, to write off the debt that was owed to the Soviet Union. And so when the Soviet Union collapsed, of course, Russia took over this. So a number of African states had a debt to the Soviet Union, which was now suddenly a debt to Russia, and Russia decided to write it off. So Russia is willing to invest, and Russia is willing to provide services for free. And I'm sure that it does in a number of cases. But I don't have insight into this. And as I said, I'm not sure if anyone really has, because often they will not say. But there will be an agreement, but we don't really know the details about the payment. But it's a very interesting point. The Wagner Group and migrants into Europe, also I don't know. It comes, of course, against the background of similar accusations leveled against Russia when it comes, for instance, to Finland. So that the Russians are using migrants, are pushing migrants forward. Again, I haven't seen anything that is credible on this. It's something that they could definitely do because it's part of the Russian playbook. It's part of how they think. We often talk about hybrid war, this strange box of different operational of tools and different operational effects. And so it is something which is possible. But it depends, of course, on circumstances, how many people are there. We could see, for instance, how they conduct their operations. Do they deliberately try to create conditions that are very insecure for people, so forcing people further away and so on? But I haven't seen anything really credible. And then on migrants in Russia, are they welcome? I doubt it. There is a very fierce debate in Russia and has been for a number of years. And if you go back to at least the Duma election in 2021, you would have seen it. But now, following the terrorist attack on the 22nd of March, there's a very sort of raw and poisonous debate in Russia concerning migrant workers. Migrant workers in Russia, of course, are mainly from Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, former Soviet republics. And there is little understanding and patience for this. So Russia is actually moving in the opposite direction, but it's caught between a rock and a hard place. It doesn't really want migrants, but it needs migrants. And I doubt that Russia would be willing to welcome. It puts a positive spin on it. One thing that I should have mentioned before, just as a curious symbolic thing, the Friendship University in Moscow, as part of this reorientation, was also renamed the Patrice Lumumba University, in recognition of the Soviet university that existed, which was the Patrice Lumumba University. So we see these patterns reaching out to the African continent with this narrative of a post-colonial struggle. But if it really extends to a willingness to accept African migrants, I probably doubt it, especially given present circumstances.
Yeah, there was a question about acceptance of rejected migrants. So I cannot give you like a comparative perspective on this. I think most countries do accept, but it's not that simple. Nationality has to be proved, etc. So there comes a lot of paperwork, and it's very often very difficult and expensive to actually deport migrants from Europe to Africa. What I can say is that there's a lot of dissatisfaction and sometimes anger related to being told what to do. So that relates to the discussions of conditionality that we talked about before, that African political leaders might be really fed up by being told that you have to do so and so, accept your people, and then you can get development aid or whatever. That can create a lot of anger and resentment. So in this ways, migrants become kind of diplomatic bargaining chips that can be used by both sides of the table, both by European countries or other countries, but also by African countries that can accept to do this and that, like with Niger, so accepting to stop deter migration and then get a lot of funds in return, but then also be able to to stop doing that and play on Europe's fear of African migration. And then finally to say that most deported migrants or expelled migrants are from North Africa. They are often expelled over land, left in no man's land, and may make their way back to their respective countries. So that in terms of numbers, this is a more prevalent phenomenon.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody, for your brilliant presentations and your answer to questions here. And thank you to you for coming. See you soon again, I hope, and have a good evening.